Now that we've considered several different views of incompatibilism, let's turn our attention to compatibilist views of free will. Our basic question is once again going to have to do with moral responsibility. Can we hold someone morally responsible for what they do if they could not have done otherwise? The compatibilist is going to say yes. Even though a person could not do something different, they could not have done otherwise, nonetheless, we can still hold them morally responsible. So that's what we're going to be thinking about in this video. So compatibilism, simply put, is just the claim that free will and determinism are in fact compatible, right? So compatibilism accepts that determinism is true. And insofar as the compatibilist accepts the truth of determinism, we can call this soft determinism instead of hard determinism. But it's important to recognize that the compatibilist rejects the claim that we could not have done otherwise, which means that it rejects the principle of alternative possibilities. It just turns out that since determinism is true, you could not do anything other than what you in fact do. Nonetheless, we can still hold people responsible. We can praise them and blame them for what they do. That's the tricky part of this view, the one that we're going to need to think about in a bit more detail. And that's because it's just not immediately obvious how we can justify holding people morally responsible if they don't have this ability to do otherwise. What reasons would we have to think that we can still do this, that we can still hold people accountable for their actions if they don't have this ability? Well, recall that arguably free will requires determinism. And if that's true, then this suggests that one could reinterpret what we mean by the word free will. So for instance, we might say that an agent, some person that we're going to call S, has free will only if S's actions is not coerced or compelled. Remember in the previous videos, I talked about how if a person puts a gun to my head and says, go rob the bank, then I'm being coerced into doing that action because it's not something I would normally want to do or have a desire to do. And so you probably would not hold me morally responsible for robbing the bank if a person put a gun to my head because I'm coerced. And so if what we mean by free will is something like acting in such a way where you're not coerced, then that might give us a plausible way to understand how you could still be held morally responsible, even though you have no other choice. In fact, if this is what we mean, if what we mean by free will is that you're not coerced, then the principle of alternative possibilities could be reinterpreted as well. It could be given a kind of a counterfactual analysis. So what we would do then is we would say, if S could have done otherwise, then S would have done otherwise. Just like if I say, if I could have worn a red shirt instead of a black shirt, then I would have worn a red shirt and instead of a black shirt. Or if you could have waited a day to watch this video, then you would have waited a day to watch this video. So this is what we mean by a counterfactual analysis, where we appeal to some hypothetical possible world where you do something different in order to explain how you might have the ability to do something different. So given that kind of analysis, then we can say, Agent S is morally responsible for their actions only if S's actions are not coerced or compelled. So if S was not coerced into doing such and such, then they could have done it, right? If I was not coerced into robbing the bank, then I would not have robbed the bank. That's kind of what we mean here by counterfactual analysis, where we have this reinterpreted way of understanding what we mean by free will, where free will is just not being coerced. Nonetheless, you might think that there are some objections to this kind of counterfactual analysis of what we mean. So for instance, when we give a counterfactual analysis, what we're doing is referring to some possible way the world might have been, not the way the world actually is. Notice that in this example, we're not talking about what actual shirt I'm wearing. We're talking about some hypothetical possible world and what shirt I wear in that world. But we might wonder if that's really what we're interested in. right? By definition, a counterfactual analysis is not a factual analysis. But we're interested in a factual analysis. We're not concerned with whether we hold somebody responsible for what they've done in some other possible world. We're interested in what they do in this world. We want to know whether we can hold them morally responsible for what they have actually done. That's something different than what they do in some hypothetical possible world. So the objection says, we're not interested in hypothetical possible worlds where people might have done something different. We're concerned with what they actually do. We're concerned with whether we can justifiably hold someone morally accountable for the actions that they actually do in the actual world. And that's just different from what they might do in a possible world. So if this approach where we reinterpret what we mean by free will, if that's not going to work, then what else can we do? Are there any other sorts of options? It turns out that there are. So a different kind of an approach says it's our desires that matter, right? We need to focus on our desires. We do what we do based upon our greatest desire at the moment of choice. So at the very least, our greatest desires play an important role in explaining why we do what we do. Consider, for example, a student athlete. They may not really want to go to practice. They may not really want to go to the weight room or to work out. Nonetheless, they have a greater desire. They want to win the championship. They want to, win the game. They want to be successful at whatever sport they're playing. And so even though their greatest desire is not to wake up early in the morning and go lift weights or to go to practice, nonetheless, the greater desire of winning the game or winning the championship overrules their desire to sleep in or their desire to watch TV or something. And so it's the greatest desire at the moment of choice that matters, not their desire to sleep in. So that's what we mean here by saying it's the greatest desire at the moment of choice that's really crucial in determining what it is that you actually do. Nonetheless, there's some things that we should think about here. Are we in control of our greatest desires? If your greatest desire is to win the game, is that something that you came up with all on your own? Or does that have something to do with your biology or maybe the social conditioning that's a result of the environment that you happen to be in or something else? And this is essentially a way of asking whether we're ultimately responsible for our desires. It's not immediately clear that we are. We might also ask whether or not we can act against our greatest desires. If my greatest desire at the moment of choice is to win the game instead of to sleep in, can I ever choose against that? So it's not immediately clear whether we actually ever choose our desires in the first place. It's important to think about these issues because we want to know what role our desires play and whether we can hold people morally responsible for what they do. It turns out that maybe they do play a huge role. And this raises what's known as Frankfurt-style cases. Frankfurt was a philosopher who presented a number of different sorts of very interesting and illuminating cases, which are supposed to show that having particular desires is actually what matters with regard to whether we hold somebody morally responsible for what they do. It's not what they actually do, it's what they desire. Consider the following example. Imagine that Smith is in a dorm room all alone. Now, it seems correct to say that Smith has the ability to get up and leave the room at any time they might like. That seems fairly normal. But what exactly would be required for Smith to get up and leave? It also seems correct to say that Smith must have certain beliefs and desires. For instance, Smith would need to have the belief that the door is not locked, and Smith would need to have the desire to get up and leave. If Smith did not have this belief or this desire, then Smith would just hang out in the room all day long. It looks like having the appropriate belief and the appropriate desire is fundamental. It's crucial to explaining what Smith does. Now consider a case where Smith is in a dorm room all alone And without knowing it, someone locks the door from the outside. Smith doesn't know that this happens. We might ask, in this situation, does Smith have the ability to leave the dorm room? Clearly, Smith would not have the ability because we're stipulating that the door is locked from the outside. So even if Smith wanted to leave the room, Smith could not do anything other than stay in the room. Smith would not have alternative possibilities in this particular case, which just means that Smith could not have done otherwise than stay in the room. So far, we're trying to get to a point where it looks like the principle of alternative possibilities is false, right? Smith is not in a situation where they could do otherwise. So that much we should have a grip on. Now let's turn to a situation where someone is screaming for help outside of the room, right? Smith is sitting there in the dorm room and somebody's screaming for help. And for dramatic purposes, let's suppose that whoever it is that's screaming is a young child. Smith hears the cries, informs the desire to help the child, and even goes up to the door, but then Smith finds that the door is locked. In this case, Smith wants to help, but Smith cannot help. Would we, in this particular case, hold Smith morally responsible for not helping the child who's screaming for help? It looks like probably no. We would not think that Smith has done something morally wrong. We would not hold Smith morally accountable. Now, let's change the situation a little bit. Suppose that Smith hears the cries for help from the child, and keep in mind that Smith does not know that the door is locked, but Smith, instead of desiring to help the child, let's say that Smith forms a desire not to help the child. Let's say that Smith couldn't care less about whether the child is screaming or not. So in this case, Smith has a desire to stay in the room and to ignore the child. Well, we might ask, is helping the child an alternative possibility available for Smith? No, it's not, because the door is locked. Now, in this case, would we find that Smith did something morally wrong by not even trying to help? Now, intuitions go in different directions, but I think arguably most people would think that Smith did something morally wrong. Why? What would explain that? We need to think about this in a little more detail. So if Smith could not have done otherwise in this case, then why would we hold Smith morally responsible? One way of thinking about why we would is because Smith did not form the appropriate desire to help, given that they heard the cries from the child. Indeed, Smith formed a desire not to help. Smith didn't really care less. Smith just wanted to stay in his room the whole entire day. So it looks like having the appropriate desire may play an important role in whether or not we can hold Smith responsible for what they've done. Hence, one could hold that it's still possible to hold someone morally accountable for what they do, even if determinism is true, which is to say, even if they could not have done other than what they in fact do actually do. And this is one way that the compatibilists can show that free will is compatible with determinism. If having the right sort of desire means that we can hold you morally accountable for your actions, then it doesn't matter whether determinism is true or not. In fact, you might even think determinism is required in order to have the right sorts of desires. And so this is how the compatibilists could plausibly respond to the kind of hard determinism cases that we considered previously. Or another way of putting that is this is how the compatibilists might respond to the dilemma of determinism.